Hello, dear listener. Welcome to the Future Seeds podcast. I'm your host, Cyprian, and in this show, I explore groundbreaking solutions to our world's unique problems by connecting seemingly unrelated fields such as technology, ecology, community, and spirituality. This episode is part of a series on purpose. In the next few weeks, we'll be exploring purpose through different lenses. In this episode, we'll be exploring a specific angle, the question of purpose through the business lens. My guest for this episode is Phil Preston. Phil used to work in the finance world. More specifically, he was in the investment realm overseeing $50 billion of global investments. But in 2007, he started asking himself, why am I doing this? And this question led him to build his current business 2 years later, in 2009, where he now is a speaker, a facilitator, and a consultant whose mission is to bring more purpose into the business world. In this episode, we exchange on how businesses can embed purpose into their values, whether it is through their mission statement, their KPIs, or their culture, and generally what it takes to have a whole company following a purpose that is not simply making money, but also having a cause. How to get the business to commit to that decision, and what are the challenges and rewards that such a business faces along the way. Phil, we're having this interview because you're an expert in delivering purpose. And my purpose with Future Seeds is to interview people who have solutions to some of the world's issues. And purpose and meaning in the work environment is one of those issues. You left your corporate career in 2007 and then started another activity seriously in 2009, which we're going to talk about. You were overseeing billions of dollars of investment to help businesses go beyond token symbolic acts of charity to make a difference. But you left that job in 2007, and the first thing I want to ask you is why? What pushed you to do that?
It was I'd say two things. One, now I don't classify myself as a highly religious or philosophical person. However, that maybe contributed to the problem because I was on this trajectory in a corporate environment and I was seemingly successful or on the verge of being successful, getting to where I wanted to go. And what I think came about there was I realized all my life goals had been set around achieving positions or achieving a financial goal. And as soon as that became within sight, I hadn't actually attained it, but as soon as it appeared achievable, then I realized there was, what else? Where do you go after that? And that created a pretty big void. So I don't know Cyprian, if you've been through a midlife crisis, but I certainly had mine back then. And
I don't think I've reached midlife yet.
Okay, well, here's some training for you. It was just, that classic questioning of, I was around age 39 at the time. Do I really want to stay in this industry for the rest of my life and do this sort of job? Or if I'm going to make a break and really change the world and do that, big thing you've always wanted to do, I thought around that age, I better leave now. Otherwise, it's going to become a pipe dream. And I guess associated with that was the fact that a lot of corporate activities were quite frustrating because I was heading up a financial research team and we could see that companies would often pay lip service to doing good. Now, I'm not saying the things they do are bad, not at all. They often give to charities and they do the right things by some people and customers and communities, but when you unpack it, they do some really, really bad things as well. So how you can't really offset some really bad things they're doing in their core business with a couple of little things they're doing around the edges. So I guess combined, when I left the industry and made this decision to go out on my own, it was, okay, well, how do we actually move beyond this sort of view of companies doing token and symbolic things and actually go to another level, if that's possible? To be honest, when I left, I didn't know if that was possible, and that was part of the journey.
Right. I've also left a corporate job, even though it wasn't for my midlife crisis. And it was very much because, it wasn't the only reason, but it was also very much because I felt I wasn't working for the right people. I wasn't working for conscious companies. and you were working in a financial environment with a lot of investment, and that has a lot of impact on the world. So can you talk to us about that?
Yeah.
How much does investment impact our world?
Investment, particularly in the last 2 years, is having an extraordinary impact on the way companies behave. But I want to go back to, so this was around 2006, 2007, which was that period where what we had was there seemed to be only one option. Like if you wanted to do something good from an investment perspective, you would buy into a type of fund that was an ethical fund or a socially responsible fund. And that's okay. Nothing wrong with that at all. But at the time, they were fairly niche products. Now, they possibly, I'm going off memory here, but I think they're around 10% of the market for investment funds. And whilst that was growing, it wasn't growing at a really, really rapid pace. And, you know, I could sort of see that the people playing in that space were coming from a very, I guess, binomial sort of black and white perspective as well. So having to make judgments like, okay, well, we're not going to invest in companies manufacturing cluster bombs or guns and so on. And look, a lot of these things you get and you go, yeah, that sounds like a really bad idea. But then as you go up the scale, you get into areas like gaming and forestry and tobacco, where companies might be doing legal things, but some of us will have issues with those activities and some of us won't. And the problem is we all tend to have our own view of the world there, and it's very hard to find, I guess, a common set of values or ethics we can agree on there. So I saw some challenges with that industry. So in the organisation I was working with, we said, okay, do we start setting up ethical funds? And if so, that meant maybe we could get $10 million of seed money. It would take 3 years to get a track record. If we were lucky and that went well, then maybe in another 3 years' time, we could grow that to $100 million. And that's how we would make a difference. So that's one option. But for me, like our company had $140 billion of funds under management at that time across the whole operation. And my thought was, well, why can't we mainstream some of these practices across $140 billion of what we do and the things we invest in, rather than just trying to create a small, $10 million, $100 million fund? Because I just love the idea of tackling these problems at scale. But then the challenge is, okay, well, if you've got a small fund, it's like trying to maneuver a mouse that you have control over, and that's fine. Whereas if you're trying to take on the whole industry, you're trying to get an elephant to turn around. So there's pros and cons to both approaches. But I was attracted to the latter one of trying to create, I guess, more systemic or systems change.
That's really interesting. Yeah, investment, sustainable investment is definitely a hot topic at the moment. And being aware of where your bank invest their money, or your money actually, etc. In one of your videos, your keynote, Why Philanthropy is for Dinosaurs, you say one donation does not wipe away a lifetime of sin. You also say that businesses often spend less than 0.1% of their revenue on their corporate social responsibility programs.
That's right.
Could you dig a little bit deeper in that idea that companies often do symbolic acts of kindness rather than having purpose and ethics at the core of their values?
Yeah, so that title is deliberately provocative, and whilst it probably gets a rise out of a lot of people, I'm actually not saying philanthropy is bad. I'm not saying responsible business is bad, but trying to make out there's a role they play, and that role is not enough to change the world in a way that, we have a pretty limited time horizon now of which we have to affect change. And if you look at philanthropy, for example, Judith Rodin, when she was president of the Rockefeller Foundation in the US, said, look, even with rising levels of philanthropy, it's nowhere near enough to make a difference. Then if you look to responsible business, where companies do the right thing and they dedicate money to their corporate social responsibility programs, that's where we say, well, they actually spend less than 0.1% of their revenues. So what that's all about is helping them protect brand and reputation risk. So the things they're doing there are to make sure customers are happy. For example, Nestle, when it's buying palm oil, It won't buy it from farmers knocking down virgin forests. It will buy it from responsible sources. And that's great, and I'd encourage that. However, for us to, I think, go out there and say, are we going to change the world by protecting brand and reputation risk? It's just not going to happen, and there's not enough money going into it to make it happen. So instead of seeing those two as the only two options, philanthropy and corporate social responsibility, there is actually a third option, and that's the one where businesses understand that they can, in the core of their business, be profitable, but also do things that change the world on a far bigger scale. So that talk really is about trying to understand, what that scale looks like, and that's what I really enjoy looking at, is unpacking companies and the strategies they use to get change at scale.
Yeah, you do say as well that CEOs intuitively know, usually the CEOs do, that it's the right direction to be heading in, but they need the confidence in knowing that it's a thing, other people are doing it, they need the tools, and they need help with bringing other people on board.
Yeah.
So that's a situation you encounter pretty often.
That's right. I thought when I went into the consulting and speaking and facilitating world that my clients would be CEOs who have this epiphany and go, oh, we've been doing some bad things, now we'll suddenly decide to do good things, and that would be my market. What I realized was, no, actually, my market ended up being people who were already CEOs who were already on that path, but they just hadn't fully articulated what they were doing and didn't have all the frameworks they needed to not only do what they want to do, but actually bring their people along with them. Because, for example, if you or I went out to a company today and said, look, how do you do good in the world? What methods are you using? And you asked a range of people across the company, you would hear so many different answers. I think you'd see that there was not a lot of alignment about really understanding and focusing on the key things they can do to make an impact. So that's really where I help to focus them. And there are some strategies out there that will make a big difference. So let's focus on those ones. And if it's adding to your bottom line at the same time, people get pretty excited. So there's no barrier there. It's not about sort of being some sort of philanthropic activity in disguise.
In your other keynote, using purpose to grow your bottom line,
Yep.
you do say some issues don't affect profitability.
Yes.
Some do.
Yep.
And then there are some that will grow the company's bottom line. Can you develop that a bit?
I better give you an example, I guess.
Yeah.
So, an example of the first thing you mentioned, if you have a bank and its employees, they'll do a range of charitable things. They'll support kids' cancer charities. Now, I'm not saying you don't do that at all, but what I'm saying is kids' cancer isn't an issue or a cause that will affect the profitability of the bank. So recognize that, yes, that's okay, and it's part of your philanthropic agenda as a bank. But let's go right to the other end of the scale, and what I talk about in the book I've written on this subject as well is the Bendigo Bank, or Bendigo and Adelaide Bank. They have a model called their community bank, and I think a lot of people in Australia have heard of their community bank model. That was set up in response to major banks pulling out of towns in Australia. A lot of towns at the time were left without banking services, and this is before internet banking. And there was no point in them just replacing a loss-making major bank branch with one of their own standard bank branches, because that would be loss-making too. What they did, though, is they came up with a very innovative model called the community bank, which is where they essentially form a partnership with the local community itself, and they do it in a win-win way. So since the Bendigo Bank started this model, they now have more than 320 branches across Australia in their community bank structure. It employs more than 1,500 people, but on the business side, it's helped them acquire 1 million new customers under the Bendigo brand name, and also grow their balance sheet by $34 billion. So the reason I make that point is, and point out the business benefits, is it's not a dirty word, not a bad thing to talk about the business benefits, because that is precisely why they're willing to invest so much in this process, and it's why they have 320 branches and not just 2 or 3. Because if you're dealing with these things out of a philanthropic agenda, you might end up putting in 2 or 3 branches, for example. But you wouldn't have the investment and the scale to go out and roll out a huge program, or 320. So that's where you can find a really nice sweet spot with companies and community interests.
Can you replicate it?
You can, with an asterisk. So this is basically an area of innovation for business. Even though we're talking about social progress and social good, it comes down to innovation. So all the examples that I collect in this space, I very rarely find that two look the same. So if I go to another bank, and a bank being one of the major banks, a lot of people have their opinions about our major banks, and they do a lot of good things, they do some bad things as well, as we saw with the Royal Commission. In one of our major banks, in the NAB, they have a unit that helps people sort of proactively tackle financial hardship. So when they see the first signs of someone in sort of missing payments, or there's signs there's something going on in their lives where they might be struggling, and they don't wait till the person falls into arrears in their loan, or wait till they start sending notices saying pay up now or else. They're on the front foot, and they've worked with some social service providers to help skill up their people and actually create, I guess, advocacy for the customer, so that they can go in and provide the right sort of help. Now, as a result of that program, they've saved themselves a lot of money as well, because they've headed off a lot of defaults that people would have had on their loans, and at the same time they're getting customers back on track very quickly. On average, 90% of their customers, I think, are back on track within 90 days or something like that. So I think this can manifest itself anywhere in the corporate structure. It's certainly not just about banks. You have any company can do this. It's a matter of saying, okay, where in our business are there social issues that are holding us back, that are costing us money, and so we could make some investments in those social issues that will actually provide win-wins. And also, where are the opportunities? What are the trends in society, and where do people need help, and can we do that and deliver help using a business model that also creates win-wins? So that's it is primarily an innovation challenge, which makes it a little bit tricky, because you can't give someone the recipe to say this is your solution. All you can do is give them a process, and I guide people through the process to say, look, based on who you are and what you do and the issues going on for you and your industry and your customers and where you work, then this is probably the logical place to be looking for opportunities.
Right. It's customized. There's no magic recipe applicable to everyone.
No, there's like I'd say a process, but not a recipe. Yes, yeah.
You're talking about trends, and that's a good segue. Trends on purpose. Is there a culture shift happening since you started in this in 2009? Have you seen a lot more businesses become aware of the need for more purpose and meaning within their company?
Yeah, yes. Whether they're following through, though, is the next question. So the last 2 years have been groundbreaking in terms of purpose. So we've had, for example, the US Business Roundtable in the US, which represents, I think it's CEOs of the top 150 odd firms, so trillions of dollars of revenues, made this commitment that business wasn't all about shareholder capitalism, it was about stakeholders as well. Now, they weren't, in that statement, they weren't saying, look, we're going to start giving away money to stakeholders instead of giving it to our shareholders. What they were saying was that we know there's important stakeholder groups for our business, and we've got to look after them if we want to help grow and prosper ourselves. We don't operate in a vacuum. That was what they've realised, because I think Paul Polman, when he was chief executive of Unilever, said, look, as a company in dealing with mass products in mass markets, there's no advantage in creating one new billionaire in the US, because they're not going to buy a lot more shampoo, are they? But if you can help bring 10,000, 100,000 people out of poverty, who can now afford our products, that's a big win for us. So the mindset is, we see that we've really got to engage. And if you go back 50 and 100 years in the business world, I think the world seemed like this unending planet and resource, and we didn't see those limits to growth that we see now. So companies have really had to adjust quite quickly. And if I just come back to the very recent activities I think are most exciting, you've had Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, a huge investment firm in the US that controls $7 trillion of investments, $8 trillion of investments. They've, they're getting right on board. They're not the fastest mover, but they're saying, in terms of commitments to climate change, we're going to be scrutinising the investments we make much more rigorously. So that is someone from the big end of town saying that, not some niche fund manager.
Do you think we can trust that? It's not just for their brand image?
I think we can, because they're getting pushed. So they don't actually own the money that they manage. They're managing as an intermediary on behalf of global superannuation and pension funds. And in the pension fund world, some of our funds, even in Australia, are huge. Like they're multi-billion-dollar funds. I think some of our largest funds are $100 billion and above. Once you get to a certain size, it's not a question of do I own this company or that company. It's a question of how much of each company do I own. So once you get to a size, you're just not small enough to choose one or the other. You've got to buy everything. So you're exposed to everything in the market in some form. So what they've realised is, and this perhaps I think started the Norwegians have a sovereign fund, and they were on board with this idea early, that we're going to own a bit of everything. So we've got to create this rising tide that lifts all boats, and that's where a lot of the pension fund market's coming from, and they're the ones who give people like BlackRock their money to manage. So it's really pushing it through. And a final recent development was the World Economic Forum, in conjunction with the four major accounting/consulting firms, came up with a list of 21 indicators. They're trying to standardize what companies report on in this space, and they came up with a list of 21 indicators. And number one on that list is purpose. So globally, there's now a lot of focus going into, okay, what is your company's purpose as the starting point? And if that purpose is not reflecting a benefit to society, people are asking, well, you're just in this to make money, you don't care about anyone else, you're not a long-term sustainable proposition for us as investors. So it's powerful. It's still taking a while for the rubber to hit the road.
Yeah, of course. For them, that purpose piece, is it based on the SDGs? Is it based on Sustainable Development Goals?
I guess that's the framework a lot of companies are using, because it's a well understood language when you're in the large corporate environment. Yes, a lot of companies are mapping the impacts on their industry and their business from their Sustainable Development Goals. Once you get down under a certain size, like into the small to medium enterprise sector, companies are a little less receptive to that, because they're typically very hands-on operators or family businesses. They might choose that framework, but really they just want to do good business at the end of the day. So you've got to be, I find you've got to be a little bit careful about what language and frameworks you choose to bring in to a company, depending on who they are and what their profile is.
Right, really interesting. How do studies explain the performance and competitive advantage that seems to exist in companies that put purpose first?
Tough question, but a good one. There was one of the key studies that came out later.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't hesitate to send us some feedback at info@futureseeds.news. We'd love to hear from you. In the next episode, we'll be developing this conversation even more. Phil will be speaking about the relationship between purpose and performance. We'll be touching on the relationship between purpose and mental health too, and why it is important to society as a whole. Don't forget to subscribe to the Future Seeds podcast on your favorite app or through our newsletter on www.futureseeds.news to get notified of new episodes.